evening. How are you this evening? I have good news for you. How many are thankful that it's Friday? Okay, on Wednesday night we kind of had a one topic, but it was two presentations, right? Last night we kind of had 1.5 presentations that we squeezed into one. Tonight we actually have just a genuine one. And then we can go home and relax, take the evening off, and come back tomorrow morning. I really want to strongly encourage you to be here tomorrow morning at 11. We're going to go out with a bang. We're going to try. We've put a lot of puzzle pieces on the table this week, and a lot of loose ends still. We're going to tie them all up, put all the puzzle pieces together, and see what kind of picture emerges from that. Tomorrow morning, right here, what time? 11 o'clock. If you can make it, please be here. It will be the climax of the entire series. Again, I'll ask the question that I've been asking the last 2 nights. How many have experienced something this week that you find of value? There's something that's really been a benefit to you. How many of you would like what you've experienced this week to continue after this week is over, for it not to end? I'm going to show you how this evening. This evening's title is, Where Do We Go From Here? Remember, Jesus came to turn circles and pyramids, the way of orchestrating our world between insiders and outsiders, oppressed and privileged. He came to transform all of those ways of arranging society into a shared, do you remember? A shared table, that's right. Jesus went around, radical table practices, and how many did he invite to his table? Even though it upset some people. Everyone was invited to the table. And I want you to hold that in your mind tonight as we go through these texts. It's many voices, one new world. Say that with me. Many voices, one new world. It takes all of our voices, doesn't it? We all have different experiences. We all have different ways of looking at life. We all come from a different exposure to how this world works. And we need all of our perspectives brought to the table to shape the way that we'll move forward. And what that's called is taking the varied and different experiences of life that we've all had, and together we combine those to experience a coherent and meaningful whole. It doesn't mean it's homogeneous. What does that mean? Do you remember? Where everything's the same. It's very heterogeneous. What does that mean? There's a lot of diversity around the table. And we need that diversity to understand how we are to arrange this new world. Look at Matthew 20, 25 through 26. Principle number 1. Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, in Luke it calls it the kings of the Gentiles. Now, did Jesus use this kingdom language when he was talking about his new social order? Did he call it the kingdom? But this is one of those areas where we really begin to see that his kingdom is radically different than the kingdoms that we're familiar with. It says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority. How? Over them. And then he says 4 words. Not so with you. Around this shared table, hierarchical authority has no place. Humans are not to have authority over other humans. It says, instead, whoever wants to be great, it must be your what? Matthew 23, he moves even further in, just 3 chapters later. You are not to be called what? Now, is that because he has a problem with the word rabbi? No. It says, for you have one what? And you are all, what does he say? This is what some traditions call, all ye are brethren. They quote the old King James language there. This is the priesthood of all believers. This is where we're all equal. And he was talking to 12 men that day, but ladies, he would have said brothers and sisters if there were women present in this conversation. We're all equal. No one is to be called rabbi, because the moment you're sitting around this shared table and one person is referred to as rabbi, what are you setting up? That hierarchy once again. It says, and do not call anyone on earth father, for you have how many? One Father, and he is where? Nor are you even to be called what? teacher, as we sit around the table, not one person at that table is to be the teacher. We're all to teach each other. How many find this very encouraging? How many would love to belong to a human community that just practiced this? Yeah. And it says, the greatest among you will be your... We are not to strive to rule over or exercise authority over others. It says, whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be what? Humbled. And those who humble themselves will be... Now, I didn't say this. Whose words are we just reading here? Some of you who are trying who really, there's something inside of you that needs to be in that top position. You're going to wrestle with this. But I contend that we all have blind spots, do we not? And if one person has blind spots and that person is in charge of everyone else, then that entire group is going to have those very same blind spots. How many have noticed that happening? The group bears the same weaknesses of the leader. This is not hierarchical leadership. This is egalitarian community where you have blind spots than I have, and I have different blind spots than you have. But as we come together, you help me see my blind spots. I help you see your blind spots, and the combined, coherent group that's produced is much more holistically healthy as at the end result of that process. This is why in 1 Corinthians 14:26, and again, we're going to move into the New Testament now because the New Testament gives us an example of how they tried to apply these teachings of Jesus, specifically these. 1 Corinthians 14:26, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, and by the way, the Corinthians were not a problem-free church. They were not a problem-free community of Jesus followers. They were a train wreck. Are you with me? They were immature, they were struggling, and yet he had the audacity to say, what then shall we say, brothers and sisters, when you come together, what does it say? Oh, what are those three words? What does it say? Each of you has a what? A hymn or a word of instruction or a revelation, or a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be what? Now, I know you've been working all week long, and sometimes you just want to come to church and let everybody else do it. Are you with me? Let them do it up front. That's not the way it functioned in the early church. Now, nor was it taxing. If we all share the load, it's a much lighter load, isn't it? Think of it this way. Anyone ever been to a fellowship dinner at a church before? How does fellowship dinner work? If one person did all of the cooking every week, how long would that last? Exactly. How long would that last? Yeah, maybe 2 weeks. You do it twice, and then they say, we ain't doing it this way anymore. And how do most fellowship dinners work? They call them potlucks. Why do they call them potlucks? Yeah, good luck. Everybody is supposed to make a little something. And then each one of you brings something. And there's this huge feast. With me? Now that is illustrative of how instruction was done in the early church. They would sit around the table, and instead of one person doing all the talking, the question will be asked, well, what do you think this verse says? And what do you think this verse says? And what do you think this verse says? And the Spirit was able to speak through these people. They didn't have all the big degrees and education that's needed, and I'm not putting those down. But I think the spirit of human community has the power to triumph over the blind spots. Many times all education is trying to teach us all education does is show us our blind spots. Am I right? The more you learn, you realize the more you don't know. That's right. Well, that can happen around a shared community depending upon how diverse that table really is as well. Each one of you has a hymn of a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. What does that look like? Don't make fun of my stick figures. Okay, we got this little dude here, this little lady here, this little dude here, maybe a child here, a much wiser person here. That's the politically correct way to say it, I believe. You've got all these people, and each time they come together, this is not illustrative of their focus, but of their contribution. When they come together, each one has something to contribute to their gathering, and the body grows. Now, I use the illustration of like a potluck. And in a potluck, it's kind of a bad illustration because some people don't have the means wherewith to provide literal physical food to bring to a fellowship meal. And we would want them to come anyway. Are you with me? But following Jesus is monetarily free. And each one of you has something to contribute to this table. And this is a learning experience because for many, there are people out there, they love to hear the sound of their own voice. How many have met people like that? And they're going to be tempted to be contributing the most. I say contributing the most because that's the nice way to say it. And there's going to be some around this shared table that don't feel like they have anything of value that's worthy enough, valuable enough to share. And is it going to take time for them to discover that they really do have something to contribute? Will that take time for them? Will it take time on both sides? Will it take time for those who like to do a lot of talking to learn how to listen and not do all the talking? Will it take time for those who have been made to feel like they don't have anything worthy of saying to have the courage to believe that they actually do have something of value? Will it take time? This does not happen overnight. That's why we say we practice the teachings of Jesus. None of us do it well. We all do it poorly. Today, if you were to look at church, now I'm going to pick on me for a moment. What have we done all week long? What does that look like? It's not that. We haven't done that at all. I have blind spots. I've probably infected you with blind spots this week. Some of you have seen those blind spots. That's why you need to be at the table. Well, the way churches function today, and I understand the busyness of our schedule. When it comes to music, we come and we expect just a worship team to lead us in and them to have it all picked out and orchestrated, right? Am I right? Not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just telling you how we do it today. And one person has prepared the entire meal for everyone. Am I right? And that's okay. But it's subpar. It's never going to create the kind of world that Jesus wants to be created. It's better than nothing. How many would agree with that? But it's not the end goal. Try to illustrate. How many have been blessed by what you've experienced this week? I'm talking against myself here. But which side of the screen is it? Left or right? We've been doing the right all week long. And Paul would do the right too, evangelistically. Paul would go into an area and he would start by doing the right-hand side of the screen. But as soon as there was a group that looked like that up and running, what would Paul do? He'd leave. And some of these groups he wouldn't see again for 2 years. And they'd be growing and thriving. And would they have some problems that Paul would have to write a letter to address? That's where we get the New Testament. It's amazing that congregations today have fallen into this being the permanent formation of their gathering. Neither side is faultless. How many can see on both sides there's problems? There'll be problems on both sides of the screen. Neither side's perfect. What I find fascinating is if when we do the left-hand side of the screen, all of the problems that will emerge have already been dealt with in the New Testament. So we have instruction there. Because this didn't exist in the New Testament, the right-hand side of the screen didn't exist in the New Testament. Today, when problems arise from that form, organizations, and they're all the same. All the organizations that I know of, all the churches that I know of, they create a church. What do we call it? A church manual. Why do you need a church manual? To deal with the problems that the right-hand side produces. Does it produce some problems? Do both sides produce problems? I find it cool that the left-hand side problems, you can just go to the New Testament and open it up and say, well, that's where they were wrestling with it. What do you think about what I said there? How many think there's a little bit of value in that? Again, there's nothing wrong with this. How many are thankful to hear me say this? Say that. Nothing wrong with it. There's a place for it. My mom passed away last year. She, in the very last her life, had to be put on a ventilator. And I remember the doctor saying to me, we have to be careful with ventilation. Because if she's on it for too long, she becomes dependent upon it and she'll never be able to get off of it. Breathing for her was that which they did in an intensive care scenario. It's not what's going to produce long-term health. Are you with me? If you want long-term health, you don't get on a ventilator where something breathes for you. You go down to the gym and you get a membership and you get on the treadmill. Do you understand the difference? You get active. Tonight is not about exercise physically. This is intensive care. Right-hand side of it is intensive care. But we must be careful with the right-hand side of the screen. Because if we are not careful, congregations very quickly become dependent upon it. How many have seen that happen? And it's like children who grow up and never leave home. It's like counselors that have patients that never get whole enough to no longer need the counselor. It's like, what would you think of a doctor who promised you a cure and yet you always remain sick, dependent upon that doctor? We wouldn't accept that in any other area of our life. And Jesus doesn't want us to expect it spiritually either. So I'm not putting this down. I think it's fine. How many have learned something this week on the right-hand side? How many it's been a benefit to you? But man, if that's all you have from here on out, you will not develop spiritually. You will not grow in your relationship with Jesus. You will not grow in how we're to put into practice. We must transist from doing purely this to also now doing the left-hand side of the screen. Rarely does a congregation ever make that transition. Most congregations stay on purely the right-hand side of the... I'm not concerned that congregations are doing the right-hand side. I'm concerned that most congregations aren't doing the left. So how can we transist? Well, let me show you a little bit more. Look at Romans 15:14. I myself am convinced, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of what? Filled with what? And you are what? Competent. You're good. You're knowledgeable. Some of you have been told you're not. You are. You know more than you think you know. And you are, what's the Latin number 3? You are more competent than you could possibly believe. To what? Instruct one another. I'm not putting this down either. I just think it's strange. I'll say that. I think it's bad. I think it's strange. I've been to churches where they pass out a little test, where you take the test to discover your spiritual gifts. How many know what I'm talking about? It's like a little test that you take, and that's fine. But which side of the screen creates a scenario where you have to take a test to discover what your spiritual gift is? Which side of this? You realize the early church would have thought that is so foreign that we would have to take a test to discover what our spiritual gift is. Because if you're doing the left-hand side of the screen, you don't need to take a test. All the gifts begin to emerge as people are active and involved, and it becomes obvious what people's spiritual gifts are in the room. It's only when we move from mutual open participation to passive spectatorship that we have to take tests to find out what our spiritual gifts are. That's crazy. How many have ever taken one of those tests, by the way? I have. And I'm not saying that it was wrong that you took it. Don't misunderstand me. It's not all or nothing. I'm not saying it's wrong that you took the test. What I'm saying is something's gone wrong when we got to take a test to figure it out. Look at Colossians 3:16. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another. Now, what is it centered in once again? It's let the what dwell among you? The message of Christ. So what are these groups centered in? It's the teachings of who? Of Jesus. That's right. And each one, where do we find those teachings, by the way? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as we all come together studying these 4 books, 4 versions of the Jesus story, when we come together, we're centered in those teachings. And we teach and we admonish one another with all wisdom. We do it through psalms, through hymns, through songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in our hearts. They had a model that they worked off of in the early church. 1 Peter 2:4-5. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by human beings, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like what? Living stones, are being built into a what kind of a house? A spiritual house, to be a holy what? Who's the priesthood, according to this? Who's being formed into the priesthood? You guys are. Who's the spiritual house in which the priests minister? You guys are. And you offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. What are those sacrifices? We'll get to it in a second. Let's start with the first one. Talk about the house. Ephesians 2:19. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his house. On the foundation of apostles and prophets, which Christ Jesus himself is the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a what? A holy temple in the Lord, and in him you too are being built how? In isolation by yourself? Together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. When we practice the right-hand side of the screen, where 2 or more are gathered, Jesus taught, there I am present. Where did the presence show up in the Old Testament? In the temple. But when we come together like that, God's Spirit shows up and we become the new temple, the living temple. Does that make sense? Does that click for you? You are the dwelling place of the presence today. You are where God shows up again. This is why, look at, flip over on your back, Romans 16:5. Greet also the church that meets where? At their house. 1 Corinthians 16:19 says, greet the church that meets at their what? At their house. And give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea and the Nympha and the church in her what? 3 passages. Where did they gather to do this in the New Testament? In homes. Listen, I'm not being sacrilegious. There is nothing special about this room. I'm sorry. God dwells universal. Are you with me? And he is just as much, when we are gathered together in this room, he is just as much present among us as if we were gathered together in a living room. It's the togetherness that makes it sacred. It's the togetherness that makes it holy. It's the shared table that makes it revolutionary. I have a dream. Can I share my dream with you? I have to be careful about this dream because it keeps getting me in trouble. Can I share it with you? Do you know when churches started to be being built? Do you know when in history? It took about 300 years for it to start being done. And you know who initiated it? How many remember us talking about the Constantinian shift? Do you remember that? It was one of the baits that Constantine hung out to them to embrace him without him having to change. He gave them tax-exempt status. That's how you really get a religious group to start becoming supportive of the empire. They allowed them to... They began throwing tax exempts toward them. They started enforcing tithe and sending that to the church by the state. And they started building these worship places that were maintained by all of this. And all they asked is that you would allow Rome's banner to be placed inside the church. That's all they asked. This would have been a foreign concept to the early church because they didn't believe church was a building. You're the church. This is just a building the church meets in on the weekend. Church wasn't a service. They didn't go to church. I think it'd be cool if we just stopped calling the service church. How many think that'd be at least a step in the right direction? No, that's just an event that the church does on the weekend. The church is not a building or a service. You are the church. This shared table, that's the church. And it can happen. You have one of these in town. I've driven past it multiple times. It could happen in a Denny's, for crying out loud. And I know that's, some of you saying, well, now no, not really, because they would meet together anywhere. The church would meet anywhere in the early New Testament. And they knew that wherever they came together, they had just made that space sacred. So here's my dream. I was doing meetings at Princeton University, of all places, about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now. And I finished doing my talks at Princeton, and a very sincere, kind, generous, I love this guy. We are still friends. Agnostic came up to me afterwards and he said, "You expecting me to buy this whole Christian thing?" And I said, "Well, not the whole thing." I said, "I don't buy the whole thing." He said, "Here's my one question for you. How can you say that you're following Jesus when you can see in history what following the teachings of Jesus has produced?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Have you never heard of the Crusades before? There has been more blood shed in the name of Jesus than any other name in human history. How do you shed blood in the name of the non-violent Jesus?" So here's my dream. Right now, among my atheist and agnostic friends, and they are my dearest friends, we are known for the Crusades, for the violence in which Christianity has performed, the violence in which we have been complicit in, and the violence in which we continue to practice towards people today. Here's what I would love. What if all Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, Anabaptists, what if all four of us liquidated our assets, sold all church properties? How many would think that'd be a monstrous sum of money just right there? I mean, that'd be huge. You know what Christianity could go down in history for instead of the Crusades? We could end world hunger forever. And then we'd look like who? You may say I'm just a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I know it'll never happen. I know. but it's my dream. It's my dream. This is the last statistic I will send out there. 80% of the money that is collected within the Christian religion on a weekend, 80%. I'm not talking about a denomination. I'm talking about world religion Christianity now. All of it, in all of its divisions, 80% of the money that comes in to Christianity on a weekly basis, 80% of it goes to maintain properties. What's wrong with that picture? When there's a hungry world around us, something's wrong with that picture. And I wonder what Jesus would say to us. If he would say to us what he said to the rich man, sell all your possessions and give them away to the poor. I know, now I'm meddling, aren't I? It's all right, it's the last night. I don't have to worry about you not coming back tomorrow night. Just want to put things in perspective. I want to try to pull us at least back to center. So not only did they view church as far as the building differently, they were the church. Romans 12:1, it says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your what? And don't spiritualize this. Were they dying for following Jesus? Were they literally giving their life for this revolution, this new world? Your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship. So not only were they the church, not only were they the temple, they were the sacrifices offered in the temple. If you can see that, say yes. Every day following Jesus was a sacrifice in that culture. And who is it that is allowed? Who are the only ones permitted to offer sacrifice? The priests. Notice what it says in 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen people, a royal what? Who was the priesthood? It was the priesthood of all believers. In Ephesians it says the gifts he gave were that some would be what? Out of these believers, where we're all priesthood of all believers, some of this priesthood would be what? Apostles. Some would be what? Prophets. Some would be evangelists. Some would be shepherds. Some would be teachers. But notice, what are all of those descriptors? Are they vocations or statuses? They're vocations. In other words, remember, he that is great among you must be your servant. We'll define these in a second, but notice, what are they doing? They're serving to equip the who? The saints for the work of what? Ministry. I'm not the one that's supposed to be doing ministry. Who is? I hate that phrase, when did God call you into ministry? Brothers and sisters, He's called every single one of you into ministry. And He's put some people in your life around that shared table, not to rule over you, but to serve you and to equip you so you can go out into the world and further Jesus' kingdom. Apostles, what were they? They were the equivalent of a modern day church planner. They were the ones the apostle means one who is sent. They were the ones that went out and set up left-hand side of the screens. They did right-hand side of the screen initially, but they set up left-hand side of the screens. Once it was up and running, took a few months. Once it was up and running, what would they do? They'd move on to do it again. They were the itinerates. He said some would be prophets. A prophet is not someone who predicts the future. A prophet is someone who tells Pharaoh, let my people go. And they were speaking out against the injustices of society, just like the prophets had always done, and calling for solidarity with the marginalized and the oppressed. Some evangelists, the word evangelist is not the way it was used today. Some people call me an evangelist. I'm not an evangelist. An evangelist was someone that was very skilled at just telling the euangelion. The euangelion was the gospel, and the gospel was simply the story of Jesus. Mark was an evangelist. Matthew was an evangelist. Luke was an evangelist. Do you see it? John was an evangelist because they could tell the Jesus story. Some were equipped to remind us of the story and the teachings that we were centered in. They knew it was an oral community. They didn't have a Bible. So they had to have the story just repeated over and over to them. And it says that some would be shepherds and some, see what? Some people do have the gift of teaching. But if they're the only voices the only voice that's heard around the table, you're robbing the church of others who have also been called to teach. And that's shepherds. Why would a group like this need a shepherd? Because I don't know if you've ever seen it, but somebody in that group is going to try to take over. Am I right? And you need someone there who's not taking over themselves, but shepherding the group to make sure all the voices, that it protects the sacredness of this space where all the voices are valued and able to speak. That was the role of a shepherd. They were the elders. And it says they were to equip the saints for ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. Now watch the language, because it gets so important. It says, speaking the truth to one another in love, we must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom, watch the analogy, the whole body is joined and knit together by, what does it say? What holds it all together? How many of them? Every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working what? Properly. That is not right-hand side of the screen. Right-hand side of the screen is passive spectatorship. It's where you do three things. You show up, you sit up, and you shut up. Those are the three things you do. And that doesn't cause growth. We have these things at Renewed Heart Ministries called heart groups. They're all over we've even got some in Norway, I just heard lately. We don't police them, we don't govern them, we don't try to oversee them. These are just shared table communities all around the globe where we're trying to at least make space for, on the left-hand side of the screen, to have this. By the way, if something like this was happening on a Wednesday night in someone's living room, how many would that sound appealing to? How many would be interested in something where you could come every week and share, and you could pray with each other and encourage one another, and maybe some food even? That'd be kind of neat. Not just throwing it out. I like to eat. Just throwing it out there. So we have these groups. I got a phone call one day at the office, and some lady was hot, man. She was fit to be tied. She said, "I hate heart groups." I said, "Good, tell me about this." She said, "I have been sitting next to Sister so-and-so for the last 20 years in my church, and I have never had to like her." And I said, "Are you sure you want to use the word like?" She got real silent. I said, "I think when you use the word like, you're enabling yourself to circumvent what the Spirit's trying to teach you. What word do you think would be better to use there instead of like? Because there are some people I don't like." She said, "You're right, I've never had to love her." She called me 2 months after. And she said, "I've grown more in the last 2 months than I have the last 20 years." Why? Because she went from passive spectator to open mutual participation. Now, is this dependent upon everybody's participation? Pretty much. I mean, if you all show up to a potluck and nobody's made anything, sit around the table and sip water. And there may be weeks where nobody prepares anything, a little something to bring, a little nugget to share to encourage. And so everybody sits around and it becomes a real prayer meeting where all you can do is pray. And that's okay. You may sit around the room and be silent, just stare at each other. Quakers have been doing that for years. That's all right. But the point is, we've got to move out of our passivity that we've inbred week after week, week after week. You come here and do nothing, if I can be so bold. And then you leave these doors, and we expect you to somehow be different. And it just doesn't work like that. Had another group that was meeting like this in Oregon. Some brand new Jesus followers showed up. They didn't know nothing. They had never, about church and Jesus and all that stuff. They were clean slate. Never been to church before in their life. Didn't know any Bible stories. I tell you what, that's easy. That's a lot easier. They came in, and this group was tempted for the sake of this couple, they were tempted to change the form over to this so that they could teach these new people. And somebody had the wisdom in that group to say, no, I'll study with them during another time during the week. Let's just keep it the way it is. And what happened was, as they were studying, these new people were learning what it means to follow Jesus, and they were getting so excited. They would come to this group every week and share with the group what they were learning. And you know what it did to everyone in that group? Listen, that group wasn't helping them. They were breathing new life into those old, tired Christians. And they were becoming re-energized and re-equipped to go out into the world. Again, how many can see the beauty in the left-hand side? How many can see how that would be beneficial? Chris, I'm going to ask for those cards to be passed out. This is non-invasive. Don't get uncomfortable. Nothing's going to happen to you against your will. Chris, I'm just asking Chris and Jeremy to pass out some cards for you. Let me ask you this. How many of you, you're not committing to this. You are not committing to this. Did you hear me say that? And this is just a reader question. How many of you, again, if this was being provided somewhere, this would be of value to you? How many? Okay. How many of you, this is so you see the intrinsic value of this so much that you are not committing to it? I'm just wanting to see where the interest level is in the room. How many of you would be willing to even say, man, I am so hungry for something that looks like that. I'd even let my living room be used for it. How many would be willing to host it? There's at least 3, 4, 5 hands in the room. That says something, by the way. Now, some of you don't have a living room to be used. I get that. That's not what I'm talking about. Are you with me? Some of you are motivated and you say, yes, if I had a living room, we could use it. So you didn't raise your hand. And you're still just as motivated. But the fact that there were 5 living rooms that showed up in this room just now, that says something to me. There's a felt need among the saints. Let me give you one word of caution as I close up. 1 Peter 5:4. All of these groups that have shepherds will have elders that surface to the top. Those that have been following Jesus for a long time. And Peter's words are very pointed. He says, to the elders among you I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's suffering, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be what? Not overlords. Be what? Shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, not because they're paying you to, but eager to what? Are you with me still? To serve. Now watch this next phrase. Don't miss it. Not lording it. What does it say? Over. Where did Peter get that phrase? Who's he quoting there? Flip over to the very first passage. It says, the Gentiles. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it what? over them. Jesus said, not so with you. Yes, some of these groups, there will be shepherds that arise, that emerge. Your goal, your only responsibility as a shepherd of this group is to ensure that it is a safe environment where every voice is valued and every story is heard. Are you with me? Don't get in the way of the Spirit. You're there just to serve the group. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being what? The way you're going to influence that group is by being just an example. You're going to lead by example to the flock. And you're not even going to lead. You're just going to be an example. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive a crown of glory that will never fade away. Take your second handout with me just very briefly. I'm not going to read through all of these. In the New Testament, there's about plus 51 another's. I want to read through a few of them. Mark 9:50, be at peace with each other. How many would love a group that was just a place of peace in this stressful world? You go to once a week and you knew. And you're not all the same, but it's a place where there's going to be peace. 1 Corinthians 11:33, so then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather together, you should all what? I love the fact that he said that. John 13:14, wash one another's feet. You could do that physically, but I think it's much more important that we do that every day in the way we serve one another. We consider we're supposed to take care of each other. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, he did not say by your doctrinal persuasion. He said, by this will all know that you are my disciples if you, what's the quality? Love. That lady said, I've been doing this 20 years and I've never had to love. She did this 2 weeks. And she was frustrated already. How many are beginning to see, too, that you can't follow Jesus all by yourself? You can't love alone. Love is a team sport. It's a group activity. It requires at least. He keeps on talking about love in John. Then in Romans 12 it says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another what? Above yourselves. Yeah, you may have something to share, but when you're around the table, you're honoring each other above yourself. In Romans 12:16, live in harmony with one another and don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of what? Low position. What was Paul doing here with the pyramid around this table? It's all equal. If you can see that, say yes. You're all the same. You're all the same. Do not think you are superior. Man. Whew. If we could just get that lesson. How many would love it? When you could sit around a room and there was no undercurrents of superiority over others at the room. How many in the room? How many would love that? For any reason. I don't care what the reason is. No one is superior over anyone at that table. You are all equal. Romans 13:8, let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to what? Romans 14:3, let us stop passing judgment on one another. How many would love to be a part of a group where judgment is against the rules? No judgments here. Everybody can be authentic, transparent, no judgment. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Romans 14:19, let us therefore make every effort to do what leads to peace and to mutual edification. How many can see that if we just use these as our church manual, how many in a group like that would be at least a huge step in the right direction? Just the one another's. Instruct one another, he says. Accept one another, he says, as Christ has accepted you. There should be no division. I'm going to skip the kissing ones. Service ones. Oh, I love Galatians 5:15 too. This one's one of my favorite of the one another's. If ye keep on biting and devouring each other, watch out. You will be destroyed by each other. It should be posted over every sanctuary in the nation. Ephesians 4:2, be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain deceit, rather in, what's the word? I tell you what, humility makes these work a lot, almost more than any other quality. As long as there's humility being practiced around that table, that solves a world of hurt. Colossians 3:13, bear with each other, forgive one another. If any of you has grievances against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Why is that forgiveness so important? Because at this table, who's going to show up when they meet Jesus? Both oppressor and oppressed. And is there going to need to be some forgiveness around that table that takes place? Yeah. Let the teachings of Christ dwell among you richly. May the Lord make your love increase, he says. Encourage one another, build each other up. I love that. I love that. I think so many times we're afraid of going to extremes that we forget that one of our primary goals is to encourage one another and build each other up. It's not creature praise. It's not creature worship. Man, the whole world is telling you you're worth nothing. There should be a community you belong to that says, you know what? You are of inestimable, immeasurable, infinite worth. Encourage one another. That's a command. Encourage one another and build each other up. But they'll get a big head. Crazy. Therefore, encourage one another, build each other up. Hold them in highest regard and love because of their work. Live in peace with each other. Let's do one more. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. This one's, we'll do this one, then we'll end with 1 Peter 4, 8 through 10. So two more. Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up on meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. I have seen this verse used over and over again. After a while, especially in the younger audiences that I've witnessed, after a while, young people kind of get bored with the right-hand side of the screen. How many have noticed that, the younger generation? And so they start not coming around anymore. There are lots of reasons that goes in. But part of it is because, honestly, the right hand, I've tried to stand on my head this week and make it entertaining. But to be real honest with you, this is the most boring. The world does this way better than the church ever will. Am I right? We're competing with some pretty talented people on the planet. We will never be this. Sorry, I know I've been inflicting you with it all week. But this on the right-hand side of the screen is intensely boring. Intensely boring. I can't do it, if I'm honest. I have a hard time doing what you did. I'm amazed anytime anybody shows up to listen to me talk. Because I could not do what you have done. Record it, put it on a podcast. I'll listen to it while I'm doing something else. I cannot sit in a pew and listen. I mean, nuts. But this I could do all day long. Listening to people, learning from people, sharing when it's appropriate for me to share. This is exciting. I have seen Hebrews 10 used to try to guilt young people to keep doing the boring part. How many have ever seen that happen? Don't forsake the assembly. Do you know what the cultural background of this verse is? This is in the book of Hebrews. That means these were Jewish Christians coming out of Judaism. They decided to follow Jesus. That means there was a transition that had taken place. They had moved from worshiping in synagogues to now meeting in people's homes. And if I told you to sell your church and start meeting in people's homes, let's be honest, how many would miss the church? How many would have a hard time with that? Yeah, how many would have a hard time with missing a sanctuary? Well, then give them some grace, because that's exactly what they're doing. They've gone from this to this, and they're missing the way it used to be done. And so what they're doing is they're moving from this forsaking Jesus and going back. And it is in that context that the book of Hebrews was written. So do not forsake, do not give up on meeting together and encouraging one another and spurring one another in deeds of love. That's the context. Last verse, 1 Peter 4, 8 through 10. Above all, above how much? What does that mean, above all? I mean, here's number one priority. Love each other how? Your top priority is not to fix anybody around the table. If anything, your priority is to let them fix you. What you're called to do is love. This shared table, the no more us and them. Sitting at the breakfast table one morning, I'm sitting there with my 3 children and my wife. It's one of those rare times where we all happen to be at the breakfast table at the same time. I don't know if you have a family like that. But I was sitting there reading a book, as I often am, totally oblivious to what was transpiring around me at the table. My oldest daughter was very frustrated with something that my son was doing, and she was endeavoring to correct his behavior as his sister. My youngest son, you'd have to know him. He's got a lot of his dad in him. He was going to have none of it. Finally, my wife, I was sitting there, I had no idea this was going on. I was reading a book, and it was a good book, and I was deeply engrossed. And all of a sudden, my wife slams her, and my wife is she's not this type of person. You got to do a lot to push her to this point. She slams her hand down on the table, and she says, I have had enough. Seen those cups where it has the levels for the coffee, and it says, nobody talk. Okay, you can start talking. Okay, we're safe. Have you seen that? You seen what I'm talking about? Yeah. So then I put my book down. My eyes are as big as the kids are. Listen, she looks at my oldest daughter and says, you are not his mother. If you have something you think he needs fixed, you bring it to me. I'll fix it. If we just followed that one rule in church, that'd be cool. That's right. And then she turns to my son and she says, that is your sister. You will not talk to her that way. That's enough. We're all children of the same divine parents, are we not? And don't we see this dynamic happening among us all too often? We're all children of the same divine parents, and we are going to have to learn to sit around the same family shared table once again. There will be moments of conflict. It will not always be easy, but it is worth the fight. It is worth the struggle. Hang in there. Do not give up. The benefit far outweighs the cost. Take those cards with me that I had passed out this evening. Again, all you're saying, you're not committing here. All you're saying is if there's a group here from these meetings, enough people that want to do something like the left-hand side of the screen, that you'd like to be informed about it so you can decide whether or not you'd like to come. You would just like some information about it. If there's enough interest and they decide to start putting some of these groups together, you just want to be notified. Are you with me? That's all you're saying right here. Put your name, either one of two or both. I don't care what you do, just a way for them to get a hold of you, either email or phone. And then I want you to do, on the bottom, I want you to do one of two things. Show me what interest level is. Do you want to just be a participant? Or would you be willing to be even more than a participant, but actually be a host? In other words, you'd said the 5 people. I'm not saying the 5 people have to commit. I said you weren't committing. I'm just saying this is an example. If you're saying, yes, I would be so excited about the left-hand side of the screen, they could do it in my living room. You could do it anywhere. How many realize that? You could do it in this room, for crying out loud. There's nothing special about the room. This room, form follows function. How many have ever heard that? The reason you're sitting in pews right now is because in the 16th century, those were invented to prevent people from doing the left side. You guys are talking too much. Somebody up front's trying to talk. You guys need to listen up. So you just come in and stare at each other's heads, back of them. So you could do it in this room, but there would be some stuff in the way. I know of you can do it anywhere again, but I know of no other environment that is casual enough to just, again, form follows function, to lend itself to this just spontaneously happening like a living room. How many know what I'm talking about? You're all sitting around just sharing. So fill those out whether you would like to be notified and to participate if there's enough interest, or if there's enough interest, if you'd be even willing to be a host. A host does not mean you're the leader of the group. Doesn't mean you're the shepherd of the group. Doesn't mean you're in charge. It doesn't mean you're responsible to make sure anything happens. All you're providing is the location. It's just like fellowship dinner. You're not prepared to cook a thing. I mean, you're not expected to cook anything. You're just providing the table. Are you with me? And then each person is bringing something to share with the group and to encourage one another. This is how I recommend people proceed from the Jesus dialogue, because really, if you continue on any further with me, you're going to also adopt my blind spots too. And we need each other. I need you, you need me. If you continue doing this for too long, you will become dependent upon that. Call no man rabbi, no man teacher, no man father. You are all brothers and sisters. For this. There are times for this. Am I right? I have no problem with this being done. My problem is that we've forgotten to also be doing this, because this is where real growth takes place. I've given you a lot of head knowledge this week. Again, how many have ever been involved in a group that looks like the left-hand side? That's a lot of you. Can you vouch for the benefit, the intrinsic benefit of these types of groups? Yeah. So I want to strongly encourage you guys. This is where we go from here. It's how the early church grew and influenced the world. It's how you can grow together and influence for Jesus too. Well, that's it tonight. I'm going to pray. You guys can grab and we'll have the drawing. And then you guys can grab your refreshments, and you made it through the entire week. Give yourselves a hand. That's a lot. That's a lot of presentations your rumpuses have sat through. I could not do what you have done. You are my heroes. Thank you so much for being here again. If you have any questions, write them down. We'll answer them tomorrow morning. What time's tomorrow morning? Thank you. What time's tomorrow morning? 11. What time's tomorrow morning? 11 o'clock. Where is it? Here. Right here tomorrow morning at 11. Do not be late. We're going to be finishing the series on a climactic note. It's going to go out with the bang. We've saved the best for last. Go ahead.